The mid-18th century in North America was a period marked by profound uncertainty and escalating tension. The continent, vast and largely unmapped by European standards, was a theater of competing empires, each seeking to expand its influence and secure economic advantage. Among these, the French and British empires stood as the most formidable rivals, their ambitions intersecting in the fertile valleys and forests of the Ohio River and Great Lakes regions. What would become known as the French and Indian War was, in essence, a struggle for control over trade, territory, and alliances with the numerous indigenous nations whose fate was inexorably tied to the outcomes of European ambitions. French colonists, seeking to connect their holdings from the St. Lawrence River to the Mississippi, established a network of forts and trading posts, reinforcing alliances with the Native American tribes. The British, driven by a growing colonial population along the Atlantic seaboard, increasingly pressed westward, asserting claims over lands already under French influence. This clash of territorial claims was intensified by differing conceptions of land ownership and governance. For the French, land was often a shared resource, to be utilized in partnership with indigenous communities. For the British, the expansion of settlement implied private ownership, permanent structures, and the displacement of local populations. By the early 1750s, skirmishes and diplomatic tensions had begun to emerge as both powers sought to secure strategic locations. The Ohio Valley, rich in resources and strategically positioned as a corridor between French and British territories, became the focal point of these contests. Young officers, traders, and settlers were often the first to encounter hostilities, and their reports to European authorities heightened the perception of threat and urgency. In these early encounters, the complex web of alliances, rivalries, and misunderstandings would sow the seeds of a larger, continent-wide conflict. By 1754, the fragile balance in the Ohio Valley had begun to collapse. British colonial authorities, alarmed by French fortifications along the rivers and the increasing number of French traders, decided to assert their claims through both diplomacy and force. The French, perceiving British encroachment as a direct threat to their economic and military networks, responded by reinforcing their garrisons and seeking to solidify alliances with indigenous nations, particularly the Shawnee, Delaware, and Ottawa. The first skirmishes erupted in the summer of 1754, led by a young and ambitious British officer, George Washington. Washington's mission was to deliver a message of British sovereignty to the French, demanding they vacate the territory claimed by Britain. The French refusal quickly escalated into confrontation. At Fort Necessity, in present-day Pennsylvania, Washington's forces clashed with a larger French detachment. The engagement ended in a surrender by the British, though the event would later be remembered less for its military outcome than for its symbolic significance, the spark that ignited a global conflict. Across the frontier, both empires engaged in careful diplomacy with native nations. The French had long cultivated trust through trade, marriage alliances, and mutual defense pacts. The British, initially slower to adapt to the nuanced political landscape, increasingly recognized the necessity of securing indigenous allies, particularly the powerful Iroquois Confederacy. These alliances would play a decisive role in the years to come, as indigenous warriors brought intimate knowledge of the terrain, guerrilla tactics, and strategic intelligence to the warring European forces. Meanwhile, the first coordinated campaigns revealed the logistical challenges that would define the war. Dense forests, treacherous rivers, and harsh winters tested the endurance of soldiers and settlers alike. Supply lines were fragile, and disease claimed nearly as many lives as combat. Both French and British commanders learned that mastery of the frontier required more than numerical superiority, it demanded adaptability, local knowledge, and the capacity to forge and maintain alliances across a fractious and often unpredictable landscape. The years following the initial skirmishes saw the French and Indian War expand into a full-scale, continental conflict. In 1755, British forces, under the command of General Edward Braddock, embarked on an ambitious expedition to seize Fort Duquesne, a key French stronghold at the forks of the Ohio River. Braddock's army, composed of British regulars and colonial militias, marched confidently through the dense forests of Pennsylvania, adhering to traditional European linear tactics that proved ill-suited for the North American wilderness. The expedition ended in disaster at the Battle of the Monongahela. French troops, aided by native allies, utilized ambushes and guerrilla tactics, overwhelming Braddock's forces. The general himself was mortally wounded, and the British suffered heavy casualties. This battle demonstrated the critical importance of adapting military strategies to the environment and the devastating effectiveness of Native American warfare. Colonial militias, many under George Washington's observation, began to grasp the necessity of unconventional tactics, setting the stage for later campaigns. Simultaneously, French forces expanded their fortifications, linking a chain of strongholds from the St. Lawrence River to the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi Valley. These positions allowed France to control trade routes, reinforce their armies, and maintain influence over indigenous allies. The British, facing repeated setbacks, intensified efforts to consolidate colonial militias and secure alliances with the Iroquois Confederacy, whose support became a strategic linchpin in the struggle for dominance. By 1756, the conflict had assumed an international dimension. Britain and France, formerly at war in Europe during the 7 Years' War, redirected resources and attention to the North American theater. The struggle was no longer confined to frontier skirmishes. It became a campaign involving large-scale troop movements, siege operations, and complex coordination across rivers, forests, and mountains. Both empires confronted the logistical nightmare of supplying and reinforcing distant positions, with harsh winters and disease compounding the human cost. The war, initially a regional dispute, had become an intricate contest of imperial power, shaping not only North America but the geopolitical landscape of the entire world. By 1758, the momentum of the conflict began to shift decisively in favor of the British. Recognizing the need for a coordinated and well-supplied campaign, British leadership, both in London and in the colonies, undertook a series of meticulously planned offensives. Key to this strategy was the capture of French strongholds along the St. Lawrence River, which served as the lifeline of French forces in North America. The Siege of Louisbourg, in the summer of 1758, marked a turning point. British naval power and disciplined siege operations overwhelmed the French defenders, securing a vital gateway to the interior. This victory not only opened the route to Quebec but also demonstrated the effectiveness of combining naval superiority with coordinated ground assaults. The morale of French troops and their native allies suffered, while British forces gained confidence and experience in large-scale operations across difficult terrain. In the Ohio Valley, the British adopted a multi-pronged approach. Forts previously under French control were targeted, disrupted, or captured, undermining French influence over indigenous allies and trade networks. British commanders increasingly relied on adaptable tactics, incorporating guerrilla-style reconnaissance, small unit maneuvers, and the strategic use of native scouts familiar with the wilderness. The war, once dominated by French initiative and frontier skirmishes, now saw the British seize the strategic advantage, pressing the French into a defensive posture. By 1759, the British executed a coordinated assault on Quebec, led by General James Wolfe. Scaling the cliffs near the city under the cover of night, Wolfe's forces achieved the element of surprise, culminating in the pivotal Battle of the Plains of Abraham. Both Wolfe and the French commander, Marquis de Montcalm, were mortally wounded in the encounter, yet the outcome was decisive: Quebec fell to the British. This victory, followed by subsequent campaigns against Montreal in 1760, effectively dismantled French power in Canada. The British, through meticulous planning, adaptive tactics, and the integration of naval and ground operations, had achieved a strategic triumph that reshaped the balance of power in North America.